In tonight's story, betrayal runs deep, but revenge runs deeper. You're listening to Revenge with Jack, where justice always finds its way. Brandon Vale laughed like he was practicing for an audience. Chin tilted, hands hooked in his pockets. The gleam of the new fence ran like a knife under the October sun, 6 feet into my land and perfectly plumb. Weekend work. Professional crew. Money neatly hammered into the ground. I stood there with the quiet you learn after years of hearing people say rules don't apply to them. My name is Nolan Hart. I'm 47. 22 years of walking wetlands in Oregon until their maps lived under my skin. I know every setback, every permit, every word people try to skip when they think skipping is efficiency. What are you going to do about it? He said, savoring each syllable like I was part of his morning espresso routine. His sunglasses threw back my face in a polished black curve. I'll handle it properly, I told him. Level voice. Field tone. The one I use when I'm standing near a sensitive creek and a bulldozer is idling nearby. He smiled wider. Handle it properly. What's that mean? The cadence of money. The belief that gravity tilts toward people like him. I've got the best lawyers in Portland. This fence isn't going anywhere. Behind him, the Vale house glittered, $7 million in marble and glass balanced where Hendrix hay once swayed. The farmhouse had come down 2 years ago, after Brandon bought the land from Mrs. Hendrix when her husband passed. She needed medical bills paid. He needed a view and a statement. In the kitchen window, Lila Vale lifted a hand in a bright, polite wave, as if we were discussing roadies. Their twin boys chased a ball over the clipped lawn, the kind of afternoon you see on a real estate brochure. I wondered what they'd inherit when the brochures peeled. Brandon nudged one of my survey stakes with his shoe. He had pulled them up to make his line cleaner. Property lines shift, he said. Nobody really knows where they are. And what were you doing with that strip of weeds anyway? Improving the neighborhood here. Those weeds were a wetland buffer. 30 feet of breathing room for a creek that stitches itself to the Tualatin. Decades of quiet work from cattail and alder in soil. My deed says that strip belongs to me. The law says it belongs to the salmon, too. I looked at his fence posts, galvanized, perfect, smug. I could feel the old field instinct settling in. Note everything. Photograph. Measure. Date. Because power often mistakes patience for weakness. Because the land records outlast swagger. We'll see, I said. He walked back toward the mansion, shoulders easy. He didn't know the difference between a ditch and a designated habitat. Didn't know that the shine on a new fence can look like a confession if you stand at the right angle. The creak sounded like it always does. Low, steady, ancient. I listened until the house and the laughter faded. Then I put my palm on the cool metal and felt the line it had cut through more than grass. Through law, through promise, through a farm that remembered. I had said I'd handle it properly. I meant it. After the divorce, I bought 3 acres in Beaverton that felt like a long exhale. Mixed woodland. A low hum of wetland that held the kind of quiet you can lean against. The house was a plain 2-story with cedar siding that needed paint and a deck that sagged at one corner like a tired shoulder. I told myself I'd fix it slowly, the way you fix yourself, board by board, season by season. Work took me all over Oregon. Upland prairies in spring, coastal swales in winter, creek mouths in August when the water ran thin and honest. 22 years of walking lines invisible to most people. Soil transitions, hydric signatures, the subtle tilt of cattails that announces where law begins. I came home to these trees because they listened. 2 years back, the Hendrix farm ended the way old places do, quiet paperwork, a sold sign in the rain. I remember Mrs. Hendrix's hands when she talked about her husband, the way she smoothed the air, as if stroking a memory into place. Medical bills don't wait, nor do men like Brandon Vale. He bought the land and erased the farmhouse in a week, dust lifting like a small weather system. In its place rose the mansion, 6 bedrooms, 8 baths, a garage with better climate control than most kitchens. Glass and limestone shining against a creek that does not know valuation. He introduced himself with a bottle of wine that had a story longer than my mortgage. We'll be great neighbors, he said, as if declaring a dividend. He asked what I did. Environmental consulting, I told him. Wetlands, primarily. He nodded like he was bookmarking a concept he'd skim later. Must be interesting, all that technical stuff. The pattern started small. Yard waste mounded near the property line, temporarily, like a shrug. sprinklers misting over my side, silver arcs the wind pushed farther each week. I mentioned it. He promised to look into it, a phrase that means almost nothing when paired with sunglasses. Then came the contractor trucks, tires sunk in my ground while they built his outdoor kitchen. When I pointed to the line on a map, they pointed to their instructions. Permission by proximity. Mr. Vale said it was fine. He apologized. Easy, polished. Confusion, he said. We'll fix it. But there was something behind his smile, a calculator where a compass should be. He was measuring what he could take without resistance, tapping at the fence of my patience to find the weak boards. I started writing things down. Dates, rainfall, photo angles. Not out of spite, out of habit. The land teaches you to document. The land outlives our stories. It deserves a record we can hand it back. Some afternoons I'd stand at the edge of the buffer and listen to the creek work past roots and stone. It reminded me that boundaries are more than lines on paper. They're agreements with time. Brandon called that strip weeds. I called it breath. We were already in a kind of conversation, the two of us. He just didn't know which language we were speaking. I spent the afternoon doing what arrogance never expects, slow work. I pulled my old survey packet from the filing cabinet, the one with coffee stains and folded corners, and walked the edge where his fence cut through my grass. The air smelled like wet cedar and cold metal. I set a bright tape at the road, clipped the end to a rebar stake, and let the reel whisper out as I walked. 200 yards. 6 feet over, clean as a ruler, every post marching in cadence. Professional install. The kind that sends invoices with logos. Where my wooden stakes once stood, I found ragged divots. Someone had worked them out with a bar and tossed them into the blackberries, as if erasing evidence was tidying up. I photographed each hole anyway, geotag on, date and time stamped, angle noted in my pocket notebook, 120 degrees southeast to road, cloud cover 30%. I've built enough case files to know how an absence can testify. Closer to the low slope, the soil told the rest. In a shallow scrape, gray models bloomed through the brown, redoxamorphic signatures you learn to read like weather. Hydric soil, seasonally saturated, the kind that holds the memory of water long after the surface looks dry. I pushed a tile probe down and felt the familiar give at 1.5 feet, the subtle spring that says, here, the anaerobic world begins. This was not a strip of weeds. It was a buffer doing exactly what buffers do, slowing water, sifting silt, keeping the creek honest after storm days. I took out my phone and opened the state layers I use for work. The screen drew its quiet map. The creek behind our properties, designated critical habitat for salmon moving like small thunder through the Tualatin system. The buffer, 30 feet from the high water mark on both banks, glowed soft blue. Brandon's new silver line stabbed into it like a careless signature. I overlaid his parcel boundary in mine, filed under county datum in 8083. The GIS cursor steadied at the fence line, and a feeling as cold as the probe shaft slid through me. This was trespass, yes, but also statutory harm. I photographed each panel, post-to-post measurements, distances from the surveyed corners. I built a folder right there. Vale_fence_encroachment_80. Subfolders for photos, field notes, soils, maps. I don't do this to wage war. I do it because memory is slippery when threatened, and the land deserves an accurate witness. A heron lifted from the sedges, drifting down the corridor the law had carved for its flight. I watched it move along the creek's shy bend and thought how many arguments could be avoided if people spent an hour listening to water. Back at the road, I pulled the tape tight, logged the final distance, and slid the reel home. The work had the steadiness of prayer, simple, repetitive, true. When I looked up, the fence gleamed the way stainless steel gleams in an operating room. Clean, expensive, undeterred. It didn't know what it had cut. I did. And now the record did, too. That night I sat on the deck with a mug that steamed like a little weather system, the creek stitching its hushed thread through the dark. From here, Brandon's place looked like a cruise ship moored along the bank. Pool lights trembling on the water, the outdoor kitchen glowing as if fire had found chrome. Pretty, I'll admit. But beauty has edges. I let my eyes follow them. Setbacks are distances you carry in your head like multiplication tables. 30 feet from high water. Greater for structures with foundations. Pools and patios demand their own clearances. The law is not a suggestion. It's a margin of breath for water and for what needs it. From my deck, those margins looked thin. The pool lip glittered near the alder's feet. The stone terrace cupped the slope like a hand that shouldn't. I went inside and spread the county packet across my table. Site plan, stamped. Environmental impact assessment, initialed. Wetland delineation report with GPS corners marked in tidy decimals. I keep copies as a courtesy and a habit, a hedge against amnesia. The approved plan placed the house at a respectful angle from the creek, setbacks measured, buffers shaded a careful blue. I traced the lines with a pencil until a quiet unease pooled behind my ribs. Something was off. I pulled up last year's satellite tile, the kind you use when your boots can't be in two places at once. Pixel by pixel, the living geometry came into view. The house footprint seemed to lean toward the water, like a man cupping his ear. The terrace curved deeper than the approved arc. And that pool, its rectangle kissed a contour the plan had promised not to touch. I checked scales, bearings, datum. I'm stingy with doubt until I've measured it 3 times. Each time, the map told the same story. I returned to the deck with a flashlight and a measuring wheel. Down the path, past the sword ferns, I stopped where the slope gentled. I swept the light across stone, counting paces, letting the wheel tick its little honesty. Up to the pool coping, down to the break-in grate, back to the alder. The numbers hummed. The creek, pale and ribbed with moon, kept its counsel. Inside again, I opened the impact report and reread the conditions. Maintain the 30-foot buffer, no permanent structures within, manage runoff to protect salmon habitat, install silt fencing during construction, restore disturbed soils with native vegetation. Lawyer words, yes, but the shape of a promise. I compared the promise to the photograph on my phone. The photograph did not blink. What I felt wasn't anger. It was recognition. The fence was not a mistake. It was a continuation. A project that began with erasing a farmhouse had kept erasing, inch by expensive inch, until water's room to breathe became a lifestyle accessory. I turned off the deck light and listened to the creek until my pulse matched it. Something larger than a fence was wrong here. And the land, patient as ever, had said it clearly. I went to Brandon's door in the clean light of morning because some conversations deserve daylight. He opened in athleisure and confidence, the kind of ease that looks like it woke up before dawn and practiced. That fence, I said, it needs to move back to the actual line. The smile drained by degrees, like a battery finding its truth. I told you, he said, arms folding into a storefront of certainty. It's right where the survey says. My contractor's guy, licensed. I asked for the name, the stamp number. He gave me attitude instead. You're upset about 6 feet of weeds. They're not weeds, I said. They're a wetland buffer. He laughed, short and bright. It's a ditch, Nolan. Don't start with the environmental mumbo-jumbo. I told him the facts. 30-foot buffer, salmon designation, the difference between a ditch and a creek with rights. For a breath, his eyes flickered, then hardened. You threatening me? Because I don't back down from bitter men protecting nostalgia. I'm boring when I'm calm. I'm explaining the situation. Here's mine. He lifted his chin. The fence stays. I've got lawyers, money, and friends. You push me, I push harder. By mid-afternoon, the mailman slid a certified letter into my hand. Harassment, it said in the careful language of billable hours. Cease and desist. Interfering with lawful improvements. It had the tone of a man who believes paper is louder than water. Before dinner, my phone buzzed with neighbors who never called. He's worried about you, Nolan, they said gently. You're making a fuss over a small thing. Ruth from 2 houses down came by with a casserole and concern, bless her. Brandon said there was a mix-up. He and Lila are such nice people. Surely you two can work it out. I told her what 6 feet could mean when it's the wrong 6 feet. She nodded the way people do when they want peace more than clarity. At 8, a number I didn't know. Detective Carter with Beaverton PD. Just a courtesy call. Mr. Vale reports you've made threats. We don't want this to escalate. My stomach did the small, private drop of a trapdoor. Detective, I said, steady. My only threats are citations in a statute book. He made the soft noises of a man filing air. Noted. Understood. Thanks. When we hung up, the kitchen felt thinner around me. It took me a minute to name the shape of what Brandon was doing. Not just intimidation, narrative control. Shift the story before the facts have legs. Paint me as the crank. Make neighbors afraid of conflict. Make police alert to my name. Make my daughter hear about it before I can call. It was almost elegant, if you didn't mind the rot. I made tea I didn't taste and opened my laptop. If you wanted a story, I would give the land its record. Not to win. To keep the promise I made when I chose this place. Listen, witness, act only when you must, and then act cleanly. Some men think pressure creates truth. Fieldwork taught me the opposite. Truth is what remains when pressure leaves. I signed into the state portal with the muscle memory of 1,000 site checks, the kind where you read until the coffee goes cold and the room shrinks to the rectangle of your screen. Permits carry their own weather, the upfront sunlight of promises, the long cloud of conditions. I pulled every document with Brandon's parcel number, applications, impact statements, plan revisions, staff notes pinned like moths along the margins. The original environmental assessment was not shy. It flagged the proposed build as proximal, within 50 feet of the creek, and required mitigation that reads like a vow. Maintain a 30-foot buffer from high water, redirect runoff, protect spawning cycles, restore disturbed soils with natives. Approval was stamped, but conditional, hinged on a post-construction compliance review within 6 months of completion. The mansion had been finished 14 months ago. No review. I moved to the wetland delineation report, its GPS points humming their exactness, coordinates strung like beads along the contour, a blue thread marking where soil shifts from sometimes wet to always remembering water. When I plotted the points, the buffer started exactly where Brandon's fence now glittered. A coincidence, if you believe in the timing of wrecking balls. I pulled up high-res satellite tiles from last year and layered them over the approved site plan. I checked scale, datum, orientation, took nothing for granted. The overlay settled, and the story told itself. The house footprint leaned creekward by a fat breath. The terrace drifted deeper. The pool sat like a cool, blue thumbprint pressed too close to the edge. I traced setbacks with a stylus, snapped screenshots, labeled them the way future me would need. Approved _versus _actual _PNG. Pool _ measure.png. I saved each to a folder with the kind of caution people call tedious until they need it. My phone was on the table, face down. I flipped it, scrolled to a number I keep for bad days, and called. Pierce, he answered, same clipped hello as always. Alan, it's Nolan. Off the record. I sketched the facts cleanly, the way you do when friendship deserves precision. Unreviewed build-out, buffer incursion, fence as a line of fresh intent, satellite evidence of a house nudged where law says no. He went quiet the way good people do when they're listening. If this is how it sounds, he said finally, it's ugly. Critical habitat makes it uglier. Our posture isn't flexible on salmon corridors. What happens, I asked, if DQ confirms a willful setback violation with no post-construction review? Fines, for sure, he said. Restoration orders. Remove hardscape in the buffer, revegetate with natives, fix hydrology. If it's deliberate and substantial, we've ordered structures out of protected zones. Sometimes that means decks, sometimes pools. I've seen a house once. He exhaled. If intent is proven, there are criminal angles. Most folks settle before it gets there. Even if it's a $7 million house. Especially then, he said. Money doesn't sterilize a stream. When we hung up, the room felt wider, as if the walls had stepped back to make space for what the truth required. I looked at the fence photos, the tidy posts shining like they had a future, and thought about how certainty often arrives in small clicks. A missing review, a misdrawn arc, a phone call that doesn't blink. I closed the laptop and let the dark speak. The creek answered, steady as a pulse. The next step wasn't anger. It was procedure. In the morning, I made coffee strong enough to hold a nail upright and began building the dossier I wished no one ever needed. I organized it the way field kits are packed. Reach for this, then that, because clarity is a form of respect. Folder tree first, Veil _case _ /01 permits, 02 imagery, 03 field notes, 04 precedent, 05 correspondence. I dropped in the stamped approvals, the impact assessment, the undelivered promise of a post-construction review. Into imagery went side-by-sides. Approved site plan versus satellite footprint. Setback lines traced in clean red. Buffer zones shaded a sober blue. Field notes got the GPS-tagged photos from the fence line. Soil descriptions in plain language. Precedent held cases where restoration meant removing stone and steel, and sometimes walls, until water could breathe again. When the packet felt like it could stand up in a stiff wind, I called the DQ enforcement line. Compliance, the operator said, transferring me with the speed of a well-worn groove. Director Thomas Keaton. Came the next voice, measured, not hurried. I stated my name, license number, and the facts in the order you would if you wanted to be believed by time. Critical salmon habitat, 30-foot buffer, permanent structures within the zone, missing review, new fence as fresh incursion. Send the materials, he said. No drama, just a door opening. We'll triage this morning. I hit send and watched the little progress bar do its small, determined work. My phone lit with a message from Maya before the whoosh faded. Hey, Dad, heard about neighbor stuff? You okay? I told her yes, the kind of yes a parent uses when they're still counting the edges of the problem. We talked. She's 22 and allergic to needless fights, which is a virtue most days. Is it worth it over a fence? She asked, voice careful. I told her what I tell myself. Some lines are small until you measure what runs beneath them. Just don't let it eat you, she said, softer. You taught me that winning isn't the point. I held that, because she was right. The point was the creek. Late afternoon, a knock. Brandon again, this time dressed casual human, the edges sanded. He held a bottle of wine with a name that sounded like a password. We started wrong, he said, smile dialed to neighborly. Let's fix it. I'll pay market value for the strip, plus, say, 10 grand for the hassle. We can get papers drawn up. Everybody wins. The fence needs to move, I said. He shifted the bottle to the other hand, recalculating. 20, then. Land use fee, easement, whatever language you like. You're a reasonable guy. It isn't about money, I said, not unkindly. It's about where the law put air for the water. His smile faltered. Everything's about money, Nolan. Not the stream, I said. He stared like I'd spoken in a dialect he'd never need to learn, then set the bottle on my porch rail, as if leaving tribute might sway the weather. When he left, I didn't touch it. The sun lowered. The house across the way glowed as if it had pulled the day inside itself. An email pinged. Receipt confirmed. Investigation scheduled. Procedure had entered the story. I exhaled, not triumphant, just aligned. Sometimes the smallest relief is knowing the next step is no longer yours alone. They came just after 9 in a white state truck that parked without flourish. Government plates, light bar dull in the cloud. Director Thomas Keaton stepped out first, tall, quiet shoulders, a clipboard held like a level. Beside him, Jenna Park swung a case of instruments to the ground, GPS rod telescoping in her hands with a neat sigh of practiced work. I watched from my kitchen window the way you watch rain arrive. Inevitable, ordinary, necessary. Across the drive, Brandon opened his big front door wearing business casual, the armor of normal. He walked down smiling, a host greeting late guests. Keaton showed him credentials. I couldn't hear the words, just saw the moment when posture changes, a smile shrinking, hands finding the belt, eyes touching the paper too long. They stood at his threshold a beat longer than comfort allows. Then they moved. Inspection is a slow choreography. Jenna set base points, the GPS humming its soft space math. Keaton paced off distances the old way, tape singing between stakes. They marked high water lines where leaf litter tells its quiet truth, paused at the alder roots, knelt to touch soil, lifting a pinch to read the models like a doctor reads a pulse. They took photos that framed only facts, pool edge to watermark, terrace lip to buffer line, fence post glinting inside blue on a map. Calm, methodical, no raised voices. The law is never louder than the creek. Around noon, they crossed the line to my side and knocked. I met them at the steps with my file, but Keaton asked only for a walk. We traced the old survey corners, the ones I'd kept clear like small altars. I showed them where my stakes had been pried, the divots, the places I'd measured twice. Jenna logged points, numbers appearing on her tablet like coordinates of a story we already knew. This fence, she said softly to Keaton, is fully within the 30. She turned, sighted along the rod toward Brandon's terrace. And that coping, 15 feet closer than the approved plan. Keaton nodded once, the way a hinge nods when a door finds home. He didn't gloat. He didn't frown. He wrote. By 1, they were done. The truck doors thumped shut with the satisfying sound of something concluding. I watched them hand a sealed envelope to Brandon. Certified, pale, unremarkable. He signed with a pen that looked heavy and stood there reading on his wide front steps, the world shrinking to one sheet of paper that would not blink. The wind moved through the oaks. The pool lights were off, even though it was day. He sat down slowly, elbows on knees, letter limp between his hands. At 5, he came to my door without props. No sunglasses, no wine, just a face that had learned a new word. Did you call them? He asked. His voice had lost its theater and found its breath. I reported a fence in a protected buffer, I said. The rest is their job. They're saying I have to tear it down, he whispered. All of it. I didn't answer. The creek did, moving past us toward a river that never negotiates. The order arrived 6 weeks later, as plain as rain in March. DQ's letterhead, Director Keaton's signature, pages clipped and numbered like a verdict with manners. Findings first. Willful encroachment into a protected 30-foot buffer. Permanent structures within critical salmon habitat. Post-construction review never conducted. Additional violation. The new fence, indicating continued disregard. Then the remedies. Remove all structures within the protected zone. Dismantle hardscape and pool. Restore soils and hydrology. Replant with approved natives. Submit to monitoring for 5 years. 90 days to comply. Fines assessed per day thereafter. The language had no edges for negotiation to hold. Brandon hired the kind of counsel with marble lobbies. The appeal to the county was briskly denied, jurisdictional and factual. The State Environmental Board hearing ran longer, as if time alone might soften statute. It didn't. The panel's questions were simple things that cannot be spun. Where is the high water mark? Why was the review missed? What part of no permanent structure is unclear? When that failed, he went federal, framing habitat as inconvenience. The court returned the case to the state with a sentence that read like a shrug back toward the creek. The law had already answered. In January, the story leapt from paperwork to evening news. A drone camera drifted over our bend of water, the anchor's voice solemn in that way anchors rehearse. Local executive faces fines and teardown for wetland violations. They pronounced riparian correctly, which felt like a small mercy. A week later, neighbors who had once counseled peace brought me muffins, questions, and careful guilt. We didn't understand, Ruth said, thumbing the brim of her winter hat. We didn't want trouble. I told her trouble had been here in concrete shoes for 2 years. We were only giving it a way out. The fence came down first, a crew in orange vests unscrewing certainty. 20 minutes, and the line that had started the story lay flat in the wet grass. It was strange how light it looked, stripped of angle and posture. Then the machines rolled up the long drive, treads gumming with February mud. Excavators have a patient cruelty. They unmake with the same calm that streams make. They started with the terrace stones, lifting each slab like a misremembered thought. The pool went next, pumps shut off, blue gone dull, shell cracked, rebar showing its ribs. Finally the walls, glass side, gypsum snowed, a home becoming ingredients again. I watched from my deck as if from a pew, hands tucked in my coat, not savoring. There is no victory in waste, only consequence. Word came that Brandon and Lila had rented a place in Lake Oswego. Someone said he was shopping the company to private equity to cover fines and restoration bonds. The figures people passed around in half-whispers sounded like fever. 7, then 8, then more than the house. Money, as it turns out, is a poor sandbag against a moving river. The day the last truck pulled away, the hillside looked oddly hopeful. Scarred, yes, but breathing. The creek ran the same as always, as if the long argument had been a human hallucination the water politely ignored. Headlines cooled. Neighbors returned to errands and weather. I stood alone at the raw edge and let the quiet say what happens next. Plant, wait, listen. Spring arrived like a quiet apology. Rain rinsing the slope, lights slipping longer between the trunks. Where Brandon's house had stood, the ground wore seed and straw, wattles stitched along the grade like careful sutures. Crews came with flats of sedges, rushes, Oregon grape, young white oak slim as promises. They planted to the rhythm of instructions, tucking roots into amended soil, staking saplings, setting small flags that flapped like bright, hopeful birds. Restoration isn't spectacle. It's repetition. Dig, place, press, water. Repeat until the hillside remembers. By June, the creek ran glass clear after storms that used to cloud it. I counted caddis cases on cobbles, watched a flash of dorsal where the shallow riffle grins. 2 salmon, then 3, nosed up through the dapple. That's how redemption looks in water. Brief, silver, sufficient. Some evenings I'd stand where the fence once cut the buffer and feel the air move different, cooler, damp with leaf breath. The land had taken a long inhale. News traveled the neighborhood at the speed of pruning shears. People stopped me to ask about native plant lists, about how far to set rain gardens from foundations. Ruth brought coffee and questions. We talked about how a law isn't a punishment. It's a form of care. Boundaries protect what can't file a complaint. Water, soil, time. If we want our children to inherit more than square footage, we give rivers room. I heard, in threads of conversation and careful texts, that Brandon filed bankruptcy. The tech company, once a headline, was sold to cover fines, restoration bonds, legal fees that multiplied like reflections in his windows. Someone saw him downtown, blazer softer, badge clipped to a lanyard that wasn't his. I don't celebrate that. Losing is heavy in any ledger. But consequence is a language the land taught us first. You put something where breath should be, and eventually you move it. Mrs. Hendricks called one afternoon, voice thin as lace. She said she'd driven by, slow, and felt her husband would have liked the way the bank looked. Alder and willow leaning into their work again. Tell the creek we're grateful, she said, half laughing. I promised I would. On the warmest day of July, I walked the buffer with a small notebook I didn't need. Habit is a prayer you do with your hands. I wrote the date, the weather, the height of the rush by my boot. I wrote, no fence, no quarrel, only room. I thought of Maya, how she'd asked if it was worth it. I wished for her a world where worth is measured by what continues. At dusk, a heron stitched itself along the water's edge, unbothered by our human arcs of error and repair. I stood quiet, letting the evening settle into the old farm's bones, and felt a truth with no triumph in it. I hadn't won. The creek had been given back what was already its own. Sometimes justice is just restoration.